In our next segment of Analyzing the Bible Through Science, we will look at the Bible through the lens of philosophy. The original and actual meaning of the word philosophy comes from two Greek root words, philo, which means to love, and sophos, which means wisdom. Therefore, the word philosophy actually means to love wisdom. Proverbs 29:3 reveals that whoever loves wisdom makes their father rejoice. So the Bible actually endorses true and sound philosophy. The foundation of all rational thought, which is required for processing information correctly to gain wisdom and recognize truth, is called logic. This means that we must first understand logic, which is the study of the principles of correct reasoning, before we can actually get into philosophy. We can picture logic as gears in our brain that allow us to process ideas properly. Once we understand the three basic principles of logic, we can recognize and avoid the common pitfalls of foolish or illogical thinking that we will learn about later, called logical fallacies. The first law of rational thought and discussion is called the law of identity. Classically, this law is expressed by an abstract, algebraic sounding phrase, A is A, meaning A is identified as A. An example of this law is found below. The apple pictured has all of the traits of what we call in English an apple. So based on our language and all of those shared traits, such as its shape, color, stem, and leaves, this image represents the fruit we call apple, and this picture's identity is apple. If someone violates this law of identity and claims that this image is actually that of an orange, their reasoning has become flawed and they will not be able to arrive at any sound conclusions in their thinking. They will become illogical because they are violating the law of identity, which connects the concept of what an apple is and the facts about what apples are with the English word for that fruit we call apple. If someone translates the word apple into Spanish, that is not a violation of the law of identity, because to someone who speaks Spanish, that word represents the same exact thing. You have only changed languages, not the identity of this image as an apple. The second law of rational thought and discussion is called the law of non-contradiction. This law states that something cannot be true and not true at the same time, in the same way, and in the same sense. The picture either is or is not of an apple. Both statements cannot both be true. The reason that this law has several qualifiers added onto it is because things can change in time or sense. For example, if I said, Fred is a bachelor, today I am correct. But tomorrow, after Fred gets married, his identity as bachelor changed, and now Fred is no longer a bachelor. That is why this law must be about two competing truth claims at the same time, in the same way, and in the same sense. If two possible statements are given, such as, this is a rock, and this is not a rock, and they are referring to what this image represents, then it is a rock is correct. If the two statements are referring to whether the image itself is actually a literal rock, then it is not a rock is correct. The intent of the statement, or the way or sense in which it was intended, determines which answer is correct. Issues like the one we just saw typically come from what is called ambiguity, which is simply a lack of clarity in a statement or truth claim. If we rephrase the statement more carefully by adding the word real, then this is not a real rock is true. But in all of these cases that we saw, Both contradictory claims cannot both be true at the same time in the same way, and this is the law of non-contradiction. If someone violates this law, they will make two contradictory claims and believe them both to be true at the same time in the same way, and they have fallen into illogical, erroneous thinking. Many today claim to believe Jesus when he said that he is the only way to the Father. But they also believe that there are many ways to God. This is contradictory and very illogical. These two principles cannot both be true in the same way at the same time. The third law of logic is the law of the excluded middle. This law simply states that a statement or claim is either true or it is false. There is no middle ground. It can only be true or false. If I said, it is currently the month of October in Texas, because of the law of identity, we can know what the month of October is. And we can know by checking the date if this statement is true or not true. We intuitively know that this statement cannot both be true and not true, and we learn through language and experience how to identify all that's around us, like months and dates, as well as all the other truth claims. It is either October or it isn't. There is no middle answer. There is only true or false. And that is what the law of the excluded middle states. All of these intuitive principles work together in our thinking like gears that allow us to think properly in rational, cohesive ways across cultures, languages, countries, and every other boundary. This is why it is critical to recognize these important but very basic principles that allow us to think in rational, logical ways. These three fundamental principles allow us to discuss and explore truth claims, while they also show us how to avoid error, which is simply a mistake in thinking. These concepts are not truth itself, but they allow us to properly process information so that the truth becomes more clear to us. Now that we understand the basics of how we process information, we need to discuss some of the common problems with our thinking so that we can avoid them and keep our minds working properly. These common errors in thinking are called logical fallacies. Fallacies are fake or deceptive arguments against a truth claim that prove nothing. They often seem superficially sound, and far too often have immense persuasive power, even after being clearly exposed as false. The first fallacy, like several of them, unfortunately, is known by its Latin name, which is ad hominem. For the sake of clarity, we will translate them from their common Latin names into English because we don't speak Latin anymore. Ad hominem is simply Latin for to the man. And this fallacy is when an argument or truth claim is disagreed with simply by attacking the person making it. If Bob said, "The earth is round and satellite pictures prove it," and Joe said, "No, you are just silly," Joe used an ad hominem personal attack against Bob instead of discussing why he disagreed with the claim. Joe tried to deny Bob's claim without actually addressing the claim itself. If Joe then said, "And you also used to believe it was flat, Bob," Joe used another form of the ad hominem fallacy called the "you also" attack to point to Bob's previous position, instead of discussing why he disagreed with Bob's actual claim that the earth is round. The fact is, changing your mind in the past does not make your present argument wrong. If Joe went on to say, "No, the earth is flat, and the Nazis believed that it was round," Joe used an ad hominem guilt by association attack instead of discussing why he disagreed that the earth is round. Joe's various claims were irrelevant to the discussion of whether the earth is round or not, and that makes them logical fallacies. All of these errors in thinking are called ad hominem fallacies because they don't address whether a particular claim is true or false. Instead, they attack the person making the claim. Let's see a quick example of how this fallacy is common, sometimes by implication and sometimes by direct allegation, in American media.
I want the right to marry to be for everyone. The question is, what is marriage? I think that marriage is intrinsically, what it is a union of a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, a mother and a father. But I think all adults should be free to live and to love as they choose. They can join a religious community that will perform a wedding. In all 50 states, this is legal. They can join a place of employment that will give them marriage benefits. In all 50 states, that's legal. You don't necessarily need the government calling your adult relationship a marriage to live and to love how you want to.
So is it what it boils down to?
I feel compassion for you. And I'll tell you why, because I know that you believe very strongly what you believe. But I also know that you're very, very uneducated in how it really, really works. That you say, and I believe from the bottom of my heart that if you really, really understood why the government does need to get involved, why it does need to be legal on a federal level, if you really understood that, there's no way that you would sit there and say what you are saying right now.
Here we saw, instead of dealing with the points that were made, a condescending attack was made on the person and his understanding. This is an arbitrary argument and a total failure in reasoning. Our next fallacy is called the Bandwagon Fallacy, and we can also think of it as the Fad Fallacy. This error in thinking occurs when someone claims that something is good or true simply because it has recently been growing in acceptance or approval. If Bob said, "The earth must be round because it casts a round shadow on the moon," but Joe said, "No, it is not, and more people are realizing that the earth is flat," then Joe used the Bandwagon Fallacy to refute Bob's claim that the earth is round. How many people are currently agreeing with an idea doesn't have any bearing on the truth of that idea at all. Let's see a clip of how this is also commonly used in America today.
That actually popular opinion is moving very, very fast on this. Mainly, I think, a generational issue as well. It's interesting. How old are you?
I'm 31.
Right. It's interesting to me that someone of your age still maintains this kind of view.
Because I think mothers and fathers are important. And I think we need to have an institution that holds up the ideal that men and women are different, and that mothering and fathering are different phenomena, and that children need
Wait 1 second. He can talk all about what he thinks and his belief, and he's seriously in the minority, especially at the age of 30. Anybody at the age of 30, if you take polls all throughout the United States right now, they are way in the majority of like, what are you people even talking about? Yeah. What issue is this?
Here, both the host and the guest use the Bandwagon Fallacy to support their arguments and make their opponent feel isolated and outnumbered. At one point, the majority of the world believed that the earth was flat, but that did not make it so. Truth is true, regardless of its popularity. For this reason, it is an error in reasoning to rely on popularity as a support for a truth claim. Our next fallacy is called the Strawman Fallacy, and this can also be seen in the media today. This error in thinking occurs when someone misrepresents their opponent's argument as weaker than it really is, so they can easily refute it and cast it in a bad light. If Bob said, "The earth must be round because people have traveled completely around it without finding an edge or falling off," and Joe said, "I can't believe you think the earth goes on forever and ever. That's ridiculous," then Joe used the Strawman Fallacy to refute Bob's claim that the earth is round. Here's another clip to demonstrate the Strawman Fallacy.
And here's one more that I've heard. I like this one. we have to, and I'm quoting here, we have to repeal this failure before it literally kills women, kills children, kills senior citizens. Now, I have to say that one was from 6 months ago. I just want to point out we still have women, we still have children, we still have senior citizens.
The argument that the president referred to was specifically that Obamacare should be repealed before some person died as a result of it. But here it's implied that the argument was instead that all women, all children, and all seniors would be killed. And since there are still all three here, the argument must be false, he claims. Instead of addressing if any individuals would actually prematurely die as a result of the Health Care Act, a straw man argument was implied and refuted. Our next fallacy tonight is called faulty generalization. This is done by inferring or forming an opinion, conclusion, principle, or otherwise from a few limited facts. This can be done as a hasty generalization by applying a small amount of inconclusive data over a whole set or group, or in other words, jumping to a conclusion. Or another form of this fallacy is called a sweeping generalization, when a general statement is applied too broadly to a specific case, so individual facts and circumstances are ignored. If Bob said, all of the planets of our solar system are round, but Joe said, all you round earthers are alike, you won't listen to anyone, then Joe used a hasty generalization to refute Bob's claim that the earth is round. People like Bob may just not be listening to Joe because all of his arguments are fallacious. Here's a clip to demonstrate the common political ploy of hasty generalization.
And I was just thinking, to me, in 2010, the Republican infighting took a particularly dangerous tone because it wasn't just about infighting anymore. It was about taking our country back with the resurrection of the Tea Party. And it was very, very racial, whether any of them will admit it or not.
Racial, absolutely. I will not sit here and allow you to say that. The Tea Party came in. There were 63 people who came in 2010 because the government grew too much because I will not allow people to sit here and say there's a racial aspect to it. That is absolutely
okay. Actually, this is absolutely valuable because what I heard you say was that the language of "take back our country" had a racialized overtone to it that was associated with the election of a black president. But what I felt like I heard you heard Angela say was Republicans are racist. So let me pause and allow you both to say what you meant to say and how you heard it.
Sure. The Tea Party has some serious racial challenges. For example, when the House of Representatives were voting on Obamacare, all of the Tea Party members that came to protest on the Hill spat on my future boss, who was the Congressional Black Caucus incoming chair. John Lewis, who had already been beaten and bludgeoned trying to ensure that we would all have voting rights and parity in this country, was called the N-word. So this isn't something that I made up. These are things that really happened and continue to happen. And I think that we see them in the way in which people continue to talk about the president, to the president, challenging his citizenship and all of those things. Is that reflective of all people in the GOP? Absolutely not. But I think it absolutely is a problem, and it has to be addressed. I can tell you it happens every time I'm on MSNBC in my Twitter feed, that people are touting that they're Tea Party members.
I'm curious, were you there that day?
No, I was not there that day.
I was actually there that day. I was doing a stand-up for MSNBC. I was actually out talking with Tea Party people. I actually saw John Lewis walk out to go to the Capitol to vote. I did not hear the N-word being
I'm sorry
said.
you didn't hear it.
Well, even and John Lewis has never said on camera. Reporters have asked him, "Did people call you the N-word?" And he has
and
not
most
said
of the
anything.
members have said that they will refuse to talk about that day because it was so insulting. They were going to preserve health care for
the only thing I can say to you is that I was there. I was standing there. I was listening. I didn't hear it.
I'm sorry.
So again, it's a difference of opinion. But for you, not having been there, and me actually having been there, when I have talked to the members myself, I was physically there.
First, we saw that taking our country back was somehow a racial statement. This was very subjective and fallacious. But then we saw that this implied racism in a specific party or movement within the party was then broadly applied except for one brief moment of logical clarity. Even if the events they described had happened, did all of the protesters there that specific day spit on someone? Did they all supposedly shout racial slurs? The nature of political debate in American media has taken on an atmosphere of hasty generalization, as one party or the other is caricatured as perfectly similar or identical within each camp. Our final fallacy for tonight is called moral equivalence. This is done by drawing comparisons between very different things to make a point that one is just as bad as the other, or one is just as good as the other. If Bob said, "Scientists have proven that the earth is round," but Joe said, "Scientists are just like politicians. They'll say anything to win an argument," then Joe used moral equivalence to refute Bob's claim that the earth is round. Here's a clip to demonstrate the fallacy of moral equivalence.
In tonight's rewrite, another episode of the Politics of Religion. And no, I'm not going to tell you about another Republican religious extremist. Tonight, I'm going to talk about another type of religious extremist, the kind that shoots little girls in the head because those girls want to go to school. That's all. They just want an education. Tomorrow is the United Nations International Day of the Girl, which the UN says is about highlighting, celebrating, discussing, and advancing girls' lives and opportunities across the globe. And tonight, on the eve of the United Nations International Day of the Girl, this girl, one of the bravest girls in the world, a 14-year-old, is lying near death after being shot in the head and the neck on her school bus yesterday for nothing more than wanting an education for herself and other girls. Religious extremists planned to assassinate her on her school bus. The man who got on the bus and shot her and got away is no doubt very, very proud of himself tonight. His spokesman certainly is. Yes, homicidal religious extremists have spokesmen in Pakistan. Taliban Pakistan spokesman is Ihsanullah Ihsan sent a letter to the news media today defending the assassination attempt, and his defense of the assassination attempt contains specific citations from Sharia law and the Quran. The spokesman said, "Whomsoever leads a campaign against Islam and Sharia is ordered to be killed by Sharia." Malala Yousafzai has, of course, never led a campaign against Islam, but religious extremists see that differently. When she was 11 years old, she began writing an anonymous blog for the BBC called Diary of a Pakistani Schoolgirl. When the Taliban Pakistan was driven out of her town, her identity was revealed, and she won an award for her bravery, Pakistan's Youth Peace Prize. She led a delegation of children's rights activists sponsored by UNICEF that made presentations to provincial politicians. She talked about how the simple act of going to school could be terrifying. According to the New York Times' latest report from Pakistan, across the country, Pakistanis reacted with outrage at the attack on Malala. But the Taliban was ready to rebut Pakistani Muslims who insisted that Islam forbids attacking women and girls this way. The Taliban's letter to the press today stated, "It is a clear command of Sharia that any female who by any means plays a role in the war against Mujahideen should be killed." The Taliban justify their every action by claiming that they are holy warriors defending Islam. Without that status of holy warrior, they would have no justification for anything they do. More temperate Muslims believe and insist that the Taliban are not holy warriors for Islam, that the Taliban have illegitimately seized that label for themselves and hide behind it to defend their actions. In the Taliban's letter, they justify trying to kill a female because the letter says, quote, "We can see the incident in the Quran of the killing of a wife by a blind companion of the Prophet because she spoke insulting words about the Prophet, and the Prophet praised this act." The Taliban defended attempting to shoot and kill a child with another story in the Quran. Hazrat Khizar, while traveling with the Prophet Musa, killed a child. Arguing about the reason for his killing, he said that the parents of this child are pious, and in future the child will cause a bad name for them. Religious extremists all make the same mistake. They all fail to understand that all of the foundational holy books of major religions, all of them, have really, really crazy, dangerous stuff in them. Stuff that was written by men, men who were not just fallible, but men who were wrong. Some of them claimed at times to be taking dictation from God, some of them didn't. The craziest stuff in the holy books is always the homicidal stuff. It's always the death penalties. The Bible is full of death penalties for not observing the Sabbath, death penalties for adultery, death penalties for things that not one follower of the Holy Bible on the earth today would ever dream of trying to enforce. There is not one follower of the Holy Bible left on earth who believes there should be a death penalty for not observing the Sabbath. Indeed, followers of the Holy Bible all over the world disagree on how the Sabbath should be observed, if at all. But tragically, for Malala tonight, as she struggles for life in her hospital bed, Islam has not reached the point in its worldwide maturation curve where all Muslims can agree that there are a lot of things in the Quran that should best be ignored.
Here the host begins the segment with a mention of religious extremists, which is also typically language used to describe a conservative Christian by those who disagree with them. The background also is consistently connecting Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in moral equivalence as all equal in teaching, truth, and, in the host's eyes, dangerousness. The actions of Islamic fundamentalist extremists are simply called acts of religious extremists, which is the same basic phrase used to open the segment. So there was a clear implication to associate the shooting of this little girl with all three religions. Then, to make sure no one missed his point, the Bible was plainly discussed as having, quote-unquote, dangerous man-made errors that call for violence, clearly tying it all back to the story at hand. He goes on to say that Christianity supposedly outgrew its violent, mistake-riddled man-made book, and Islam should now do the same. The target was to connect Christianity to Islam, the Bible to the Quran, and Muslim religious extremists who shoot girls in the head to Christian fundamentalists who feed the hungry, take care of the poor, and believe their Bibles. This was propaganda at its worst. There's a reason we call these TV shows programs. They are programming anyone who does not practice critical thinking. If these folks came out and told you what they thought of your biblical beliefs plainly, you would never listen to them again. So instead, they try to slowly lead you away from them, one fallacy after another. Just seeing the attacks against Christianity through the lens of logic reveals that the Bible is correct, and we must not be cheated by the world's philosophy or its empty deceit. and understanding their tactics helps us to obey this passage. All of these examples show us how prevalent logical fallacies are in America and how important logic is for determining truth. So we will continue to look at some more logical fallacies next week as we prepare to look at the Bible through the lens of philosophy in the coming weeks.